I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. We are going to switch gears now to talk about a big story in music. Have a listen to this.
I keep on falling in love with you.
That is a bit of Fallen, the debut single from Alicia Keys. Huge song. Alicia's had a gigantic career. She's just one of many artists that Clive Davis helped turn into mega pop stars. Clive Davis was the definition of a music mogul. He died this past Monday. He was 94 years old. And from Alicia Keys to Carly Rae Jepsen to Bruce Springsteen and Aretha Franklin, he leaves a gigantic 60-year-plus legacy of defining pop music as we know it. Professor Mark Anthony Neal is here to talk about Clive Davis and his star-making legacy. Marks, welcome back. Good to see you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. How you doing today?
Pretty good, man. Listen, let me start with this. For those people who are maybe unfamiliar with Clive Davis's origin story, how does he first get this reputation for being a star maker?
He's legal counsel at Columbia, right? CBS Records in late 1960s. And, he wants to get into the record business. And, he's the one who's helping to craft Sly and the Family Stone, Carlos Santana, all these incredible figures who are making this transition, Laura Nero, all these incredible artists. His biggest imprint, begins in 1972 when he's at CBS and he asked a couple of business students up at Harvard to create a report, and it was called now the Harvard Report on the Black Music Culture, and it really is a blueprint for the corporate takeover of Black popular music in the 1970s, which at that point in time was dominated by independent labels like Motown, et cetera, et cetera. The initial product of that moment, of course, is Philadelphia International Records and Leon Huff and Kenny Gamble and the creation of Philly Soul. That's all stuff that was able to be built out because of the value that Clive Davis saw in Black music and how it was being undervalued within the corporate structures.
Yeah, I mean, like, listen, he literally was a student of Black culture. He studied so closely that to produce a report like that in order to, actually devise that blueprint that we're talking about. And obviously, we can't talk about Clive Davis's pop legacy without talking about this artist right here.
Because the greatest love of all is happening to me.
Nothing like that voice. That is the greatest love of all. That is Whitney Houston. Mark, what role did Clive Davis play in Whitney Houston's rise to pop stardom?
Clive Davis needed a pop star. And he was searching for that talent, and he happened to be at a talent show, and Whitney Houston, who's also interested in being modeling, sings this song, The Greatest Love of All, right? Which, of course, is a George Benson song, was recorded 5 years earlier or 7 years before Whitney records it as part of a biopic about Muhammad Ali that starred Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
It was a hit for George Benson. And Davis heard Whitney Houston singing, and he knew that he had found his pop star. He had found his pop queen. And when all is said and done, when we look at Clive Davis's, career and legacy, his biggest pop success unquestionably was the career of Whitney Houston.
Yeah. The big lore, I think, with Clive Davis is that it was not just that he had this incredible ear for picking out, these gigantic hits for these artists, but also it's that he developed relationships and trust with these artists. Like, they sort of really put their trust in him to guide and steward their careers. Do you want to talk about how that happened? Like, talk a little bit about the trust that he instilled in those stars.
I mean, you just look at some of the artists that, he brings about. He leaves Columbia 73, starts his own label, Arista Records. One of his early successes is Barry Manilow, who we
Yeah.
forget how important of a pop star he was in the late 1970s. The first artist that he actually signs to Arista Records is Gil Scott-Heron,
Whoa.
right?
Yeah.
Who
I don't think I knew.
records
I didn't know that.
Johannesburg. Yeah, who records Johannesburg a year later. You look at how he takes, two pop stars from the 1960s, Aretha Franklin and Dionne Warwick, who are on the downside of their careers in the 1970s. They both come to Arista in the late 1970s and become even bigger pop stars than they were in their heyday 20 years earlier.
Yeah.
So he created that trusted artist, right, who really wanted to work with him, who understood that he knew how to make them stars.
I gotta tell you, I keep reading of this three-legged stool philosophy that he had on hit songs, but I don't know what that is. Would you mind explaining what that is to me?
Yeah, he had this idea that, to have a hit song, you needed the artist, right? Which meant you needed the voice, you needed the songs, but then you also needed a quality of production that would make people want to go back and listen to it over and over again.
Hmm.
The one thing you will always say about Whitney Houston's music in the early part of her career with Arista is that he picked,
Oh, we might be losing you a little bit there, Professor
and
Neal.
of course,
Oh, we're
Whitney,
back.
and yeah,
You're back. You're back. Sorry, continue your point
yeah,
there. You
and
lost you for a moment.
what we know is that with Whitney Houston, you had the great songs that had pop appeal, you had this quality production, and then of course Whitney brought the voice
Yeah.
that made it all work.
Those are the things you keep returning to over and over again. Listen, I got to ask you, earlier this year, you were part of a panel that we did on the historic ties between Black and Jewish American record executives and how those ties shape pop music right now. Clive Davis was, in fact, Jewish American. How do you think that legacy fits into all of this?
I mean, it fits perfectly within the rubric of what we see around this relationship.
Yeah.
The music industry gave ethnic Americans an opportunity to be able to run their own things, to have control, to have influence on the culture. Clive Davis is certainly not the first, Jewish producer or songwriter or record exec, right? He might be the most famous and the most successful,
Yeah.
but that template was already there when Clive Davis got involved in the music industry. And let's not discount, that on some level he obviously had a love of Black culture and love of Black music.
Hmm. Okay, now I just want to just play you a little bit of a package right here. Let's listen to this.
Listen to me. Don't go chasing waterfalls. Please stick to the rivers and the lakes that you're used to.
It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine. Salt and pepper and heavy D up in the limousine. Hanging pictures on my wall. Every Saturday, rap attack Mr. Magic Molly Mall.
I'm sorry, Miss Jackson. I am for real. Never meant to make your daughter cry. I apologize a trillion times.
Three of the biggest hits of the last 40 years. You got Waterfalls, TLC, you got B.I.G. with Juicy, and you got Miss Jackson with Outkast. Mark, what's Clive Davis's connection to all those three hits?
Two labels, LaFace and Bad Boy Records. Yeah, I'd mentioned Philadelphia International Records earlier. That model was a boutique model, right? Where you would find great producers and songwriters, you'd give them a little boutique label, they'd find the artists, and then CBS would promote them. He replicated that process over and over again at Arista, so that when he sees Bad Boy and you see Sean Combs being fired, by MCA and Andre Harrell. He brings them on to create a boutique label. That boutique label is Bad Boy. Same thing with L.A. Reid and Kenny Edmonds, who were great producers, working with Solar Records and a bunch of artists. He gives them their own shop, right? And they create some of the greatest pop music and R&B crossover music, of that particular generation. It is notable that when Whitney Houston finally records what I would describe as a Black album, or her Blackest album, she does so under the auspices of being produced by L.A. Reid and Kenny Edmonds.
Mark, the idea of like those three songs, those are load-bearing songs to me. Like they're just they're incredibly important songs, and they wouldn't exist without this one person. That's really important. We've touched on the ways that he's kind of Clive Davis has shaped pop music over the last 50 years, but he has received his fair share of criticism too. What were some of the criticisms against Clive Davis?
The biggest thing is that he would do everything to have a pop hit.
Hmm.
Before he found Whitney Houston, the artist who represented what Whitney Houston became or would become was Phyllis Hyman, who was well known on Broadway, had an incredible voice. She did her first 4 or 5 albums with Arista, and they often battled over the fact that Phyllis Hyman's roots were in jazz and soul music. She wanted to do stuff that was much more reflective of those tastes. He wanted her to sing pop songs, right? So there was always that tension. And I think in many ways, even when you see the trajectory of Whitney Houston's career, there's no question, right? Whitney Houston is the crossover pop star of the 1980s. But when Whitney Houston gets booed at the Soul Train Awards in the late 1980s, they're not booing Whitney. They're not booing her talent. they're booing the fact that she's recording music that doesn't sound like traditional R&B or soul music, right?
Yeah.
It's mood music that's being pitched to a pop audience that Black audiences were beginning to resist, particularly in this moment where hip hop is becoming so influential. And I think you see some of the quote unquote bad behavior that we see from Whitney Houston is really her pushing back against these kind of controlling elements that once she became this big star, right, she had very little wiggle room in terms of really fully exploring her creative sensibilities in that period of time.
Of course. Listen, we've been talking about Clive Davis at a moment when there's all these polarizing debates happening around artificial intelligence and how it's going to shape the future of the music industry. What do we know about Clive Davis's feelings when it came to the use of AI in music?
Uh, he was not someone was supportive of it.
Hmm.
And it makes sense, right? He came up of a generation where you wrote a great song, you found a great singer, and you tried to present that into the public. I don't think Clive Davis was as interested in the hunt,
Mm-hmm.
in the process, as he was the outcome.
Yeah.
AI doesn't allow you to do the hunt and the process.
There's no development
It's just
with
the
AI.
outcome.
Yeah.
There's no and when all is said and done, at his core, Clive Davis was an A&R guy, artist and repertoire. That's what he was. And AI really cuts that process out of it.
Yeah. I got to tell you, we barely scratched the surface of Clive Davis's impact on pop music. But just before we go, how are you going to remember Clive Davis's pop music legacy?
I think other than Quincy Jones, there's no more compelling figure who impacted what we hear in pop radio and pop music every day than Clive Davis.
Wow. That's a significant statement and also really worth reflecting on. So thank you for that. I really appreciate you being here. I really appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Mark Anthony Neal is a James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University. Clive Davis died earlier this week. He was 94 years old. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll see you tomorrow.